Well, we may still have Starship floating around in the Indian Ocean, but back on land, things are moving at a breakneck pace as Flight 14 gets ever closer. Yes, the preparations for that first ever ship catch are becoming increasingly obvious, and we even have huge news in Florida with questions finally answered that we have been asking for years. Somehow that's only the beginning of another completely packed week, with this rocket looking like it has come right from one of my early Kerbal Space Program designs. Ouch. We have NASA dropping loads about their magnetoplasmadynamic engine tests, a breathtaking total solar eclipse, and Rocket Lab are going portable. Indeed, we have all that and more this week.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Hey, Marcus House with you here, and as far as we know, Ship 40 is still out there 3 weeks after splashing down after Starship Flight 13. The team SpaceX had out there trying to recover it on board the vessel Normand Ranger were still attached midweek, and thanks to the tracking information on the vessel, the behaviour seemed pretty consistent with an effort to tow the beast. The thing is, they weren't getting closer to Australia, instead heading more northward. They seemed to be fighting the wind and currents, but not looking like they could fight it enough to make any real progress. We suspect this has all simply been a stabilisation effort to this point due to that poor weather. If they were able to get underway, we would have had a better idea what the tow speed would be as it moved toward the destination port there. I mean, as we learned a week ago, the recovery of Ship 40 was not looking good. The weather should have been improving later in the week out there though, but at this point I guess no news is, well, okay news. Looking at the position of the vessels on Friday evening, Normand Ranger had left Ship 40, made its way further north to Christmas Island, presumably to be resupplied, while Go Australis, which had returned to help with Starship recovery earlier in the week, seems to be staying here to watch over Ship 40. Do you think they'll get it back? Let me know in the comments. So with that recovery effort, many have asked me why SpaceX is even bothering at this point. If it takes a month to get it back, SpaceX may even have a flown Starship returned home to be caught out of the sky by then. Flight 14 in terms of its predicted flight timeline still looks to be at the end of this month, but with only a little over 2 weeks remaining now, we sure haven't seen the activity that would be consistent with this epic mission happening that quickly. For that timeline to hold, I would expect that we would have at least had Ship 41 out for its static fire already, if not the Super Heavy as well, but we have not seen either vehicle roll for that fiery testing this week. If things move fast from this point, it could be possible, but it is looking like September to us at this point. One of the things causing a few delays, I suspect, is from the Pad 2 side. We can see that down inside the flame trench they are still busy welding new burn plates into the corners thanks to these views from RGV aerial photography. Given they are likely wanting the Super Heavy out here for static fire as soon as possible, I can't imagine this work is going to take too much longer to polish off. Along with that, in an effort to help speed up the pad refurbishment timeline though, this week we saw the delivery of some particularly odd looking pieces, and the awesome Chrome Kiwi was quickly able to piece this together. The thought is that once both pieces are fitted together, this jig is going to be used as a service platform for the new launch mount design. This is sort of a similar idea to what was used at Pad 1, which already feels so long ago. This new jig though, as far as we can tell, will only be used to service the launch mount itself, not a super heavy booster that sits above. I say this because it looks like it is to be lifted in and out of the mount from above and not lifted from underneath. It also looks to take up space where the Super Heavy's engines would otherwise sit rather than being a little further below. So why would they be doing this now? Well, if you haven't noticed already, they have had to install this absolute jungle of scaffolding in and around the launch mount after both Flights 12 and 13 just to do the proper inspections. This is a critical task, of course, because they need to make sure that the pad design is holding up as expected, but this scaffolding prep work takes time, and I'm sure that is currently quite frustrating. Well, hopefully not much longer with this new jig. Now, moving up this tower, you may have noticed the scaffolding which was installed over the last few weeks, but it wasn't too clear why it was all there to begin with. Now that it is coming back down, we can clearly see why. These additional tabs along the corners are the first signs that more cladding is about to be installed, and it appears that they intend to have it cover all the way up to at least the ship quick disconnect. We suspect this is all in preparation for the upcoming ship catch attempt. SpaceX would be wanting to make sure that any of that Raptor engine exhaust doesn't blast into the tower area and cause damage. Okay, so heading over to Pad 1 that is rapidly being upgraded, there is something new to talk about over here every week. The biggest thing which may stand out today is the Drawworks bunker, which has absolutely flown up. It is exciting finally seeing all these parts going together again instead of being removed. Alongside, we have obviously been watching the trench walls being pre-assembled. Now we have seen them adding on the sloped edges for the flame trench. There should be 4 of these once complete. Down inside the trench, by the way, rebar is beginning to be laid down at the bottom for the giant cages. These will support all the embeds for the flame trench and the trench walls. Moving over into the tank farm, this week we saw them deliver 2 more cryogenic storage tanks to the launch site, which took up the 2 pedestals on the right. There should be just the 4 more tanks remaining before this side of the launch site is packed full. Any extensions after this point will presumably go south into the new site expansion. Well, we already see SpaceX beginning work in this area, which we suspect is for that. Now, it has been quite some time since we've talked about the air separation unit across the road, but we can now see SpaceX beginning to assemble this brand new building. This looks to be part of a cooling tower for the electrical systems involved in the air separation process. I can't wait to see this development finalised because it should mean SpaceX can obtain all that liquid nitrogen and liquid oxygen right from this point without any trucks needing to roll in for that supply. Now over in Florida, we of course have another 2 launch sites with 3 more Starship launch pads getting constructed. Because they don't have their own star factory over here yet, the supply of Starships to launch initially will depend on Starbase in Texas. The launch tower at Launch Complex 39A though will be the first to be operational here, and it is very nearly complete. In fact, the tower arms were being tested this week with the iconic water bags finally making that appearance. SpaceX fill these bags with hundreds of tons of water while they are being suspended from both arms. They then run a series of tests to make sure that they can support the weight of a vehicle being lifted and lowered, but also that a vehicle coming in to be caught will have the needed margins. If you think about the worst case scenario, they want to make sure that even if a massive super heavy booster comes in with a little excess speed, the arms can take a little bit of extra punishment. In the first test here, they filled the bags at the bottom of the tower before they then did the full translation up, over to the centre, down to the ship quick disconnect, and then back over and down. The next few tests were done using the arms at the very top of the tower. In this case, they suspend the water bags from the super long steel cables at the bottom. We saw SpaceX do this at Pad 2 at Starbase as well, and we believe this test is more about checking how well the tower itself flexes and bends with that much weight attached to the side. Now, thanks to Harry Stranger and Planet Labs organising some fresh views from above, we have some updated shots of the various launch sites across the Space Coast. There's lots of amazing detail here, so do give Harry a follow there, especially if you are also into exploring historic declassified spy satellite images. Right here though, we are more interested in the second and even bigger Starship launch site, Space Launch Complex 37. We can see here they are beginning to install those deluge tanks onto their platforms, and the pedestals for the cryogenic storage tanks are constructed and waiting for them to arrive. Right up through the site here though, you will notice the long run of conduit which will provide the Pad 37A launch mount with all the data and power that it needs. You may also notice that the tower is fully stacked now, which was confirmed with an image by SpaceX's VP of Launch. That is not all either, because check this out, concrete piles for the Pad 37B foundation are now visible. This ring of piles here is for the staging pad just below where the tower arms would be. Starship vehicles will be lifted and lowered from this spot, so this is very cool to already see. There are also piles over here for where the commodities bunker will rise up, so yeah, just to give you an idea of what this pad will likely end up looking like, here is 37A's current progress placed right over. Both of these pads, at least for the time being, look to be sharing a tank farm and a water deluge supply. It really is quite incredible that despite not having done the first operational mission to orbit with Starship, we have more launch pads under construction right now than Falcon 9 has ever had. Once SpaceX is all set up, the launch frequency is going to be something out of this world, quite literally. Now, to top it all off for Florida updates, we are finally seeing permits for a development northwest of SpaceX's existing Roberts Road facility. This is one large part of the puzzle that you have had many questions about for years at this point, and we've often wondered ourselves where SpaceX is going to do upper stage Starship static fires here. Well, question that no more, because finally we have Project Ignition. This is where they intend to do all that testing similar to what we see at Massey's. Unlike Massey's though, it won't have the extra test stands for test tanks because the research and development part of Starship should remain in Starbase. Instead, they seem to be filling this space with 2 Starship static fire stands, with each looking to have their own set of redundant systems in between. In front of these stands is what appears to be an open concrete pad with a deluge water collection pit at the end. So yeah, SpaceX is just smashing the work out around all the sites, even while they try to recover Ship 40 floating out here since the 13th flight test. There has been a lot of discussion around Starship Flight 13 over the past few weeks, of course, but depending on where you are following it, you could be almost forgiven for thinking that people were watching completely different launches. Some headlines focused on the successful deployment of the never-before-launched version 3 Starlink satellites, others zeroed in on the super heavy issues that led to an incorrect soft splashdown, making it sound like a negative story, while others focused on the narrative about the incredible successes from the upper stage Starship. That's one of the reasons I've been using ground news, especially for stories that I'm not so familiar with, because there is bias everywhere. When you take a look at this Flight 13 article on ground news, we can instantly see how widely the story is being covered, who is covering it, and how differently it is being framed across the media landscape. At a glance, I can see the spread across left, centre and right-leaning outlets. With that, I can see how factual the reporting is rated overall and whether certain perspectives are being underreported entirely. That's incredibly useful because stories like this don't just sit in a world of engineering anymore. They cross into politics, business, defence and personalities, and it is very easy for actual missions to get buried under layers of spin. Ground news pulls all this together in the one place so that you are not locked into just that single perspective. They are independent and subscriber funded, so give it a try. You can pick up the same plan I use for just $5 a month by heading to ground.news/Marcus using that link in the description, or you can scan the QR code right there on screen. That's almost half off, by the way, so if you like getting a balanced view of what's actually happening rather than just the one version of a story, I think you'll find this incredibly useful. Thank you, Ground News. Okay, we still have another chunk of Falcon 9 launches this week, but also Starlink updates. First of all, Group 1738 was away from Vandenberg Space Force Base a few hours after my video went live last Saturday morning. It was another foggy one there, with booster 1093 launching out of that thick cover on its 16th flight as it pushed this batch of 24 Starlinks out of the atmosphere. Of course, I Still Love You was downrange for the catch with this one, and then we had Group 1019 away from Space Launch Complex 40 on Tuesday morning. It was a comparatively clear and beautiful launch, this one. Nice onboard views too as we watch Cape Canaveral shrink behind there as booster 1085 made its way to stage separation for the 18th time. Remember, SpaceX now only has the 2 drone ships for Falcon 9 missions these days, so it was a shortfall of gravitas awaiting the booster to once more touch down on the deck. Some sweet views from that camera. They were really going for it this week because less than 13 hours later, the next was away back in Vandenberg on Tuesday evening with Group 1749. Only a very young booster 1103 this time, and of course I Still Love You catching this one had already done a full round trip to be back out here again in under 4 days. They don't mess around. Now, if you have been watching all the group numbers lately, you would realise that we've just been watching SpaceX place groups 10 and 17 sets into orbit primarily, and right now, SpaceX are coming up to having 11,000 Starlinks in orbit in total. I suspect after we see them finalise those groups for 10 and 17, that may be about it for Falcon 9 Starlink missions. At this point, Starship missions to send the much more capable and larger version 3 satellites will change the game entirely. As was mentioned in the earnings call last week, the version 3 satellites have about 10 times more capability, which should mean roughly 10 times the revenue that can be earned from one single unit. Gwen Shotwell even mentioned in that call that Q2 this year was their best yet for Starlink, with the customer base growing by more than 1.7 million subscriptions, beating their previous best of 1.4 million. What SpaceX really wants to see by the end of Q2 next year, though, is about 1,000 version 3 Starlink satellites to have been deployed by Starship, so I guess they are hoping for about 25 launches between now and then. Yeah, they are certainly going to need to get into gear, because if we are not seeing a launch every 2 weeks on average between now and then, they won't make it. Of course, during that earnings call, they also talked a bunch about the StarMind satellite network. They will be making these AI satellites using exclusive tech from NVIDIA for now at least, but they want these to be launching by sometime in 2027 as well. I can't wait to see what sort of orbits these are going to be placed into, because without orbital refilling, Starship will only be able to get them so high. Perhaps each unit will then over time extend their orbits right out. I mean, if these are loads higher, which we certainly expect them to be, they are not going to need anywhere near the propellant to just keep fighting drag. I'd also love to see what happens to these once they are at the end of their life. Perhaps they have the propellant left to come right back down, be loaded into a Starship and recycled entirely, but it is of course all very speculative until we get some official information. Now, we had some unfortunate news from China, as early in the week there was a pretty wild rocket failure. On Monday evening, a Long March 7A lifted off carrying a classified payload, and due to the confidential nature of this mission, there wasn't really any sort of broadcast. From the ground though, everything looked fine at first, right until the rocket was close to the maximum dynamic pressure point, or max Q, essentially the point where the aerodynamic stress on the vehicle reaches the highest level. At about 1 minute and 20 seconds into the flight, the rocket suddenly exploded, and these views captured by people on the ground were soon all over social media. There was speculation at first that it could have been a failure of their YF-100 rocket engine, which is one of China's most widely used. If that turned out to be true, that would have some pretty serious repercussions, because the same engine family powers a huge portion of China's launch vehicles, including the Long March 5, 7 and 8. Of course, afterward, this video surfaced which added some much better evidence to the situation. Indeed, much like some of my earlier Kerbal Space Program rockets, this clearly shows the top end of the rocket bend over and break apart, smashing right into the first stage. This, we can likely assume, also triggered the flight termination system, leading to the rapid demise of the entire vehicle. Looking at this even more closely, it looks like the vehicle gave way right around the point where the second stage joins the third. That's pretty weird, considering they've already launched 3 of these rockets this year alone. Anyway, I'm not sure if they had disabled auto-strut for this mission or what, but it was certainly all very unexpected. It is going to be interesting to see how long they have the rocket grounded before we see the next flight. Now, Rocket Lab made a very interesting announcement this week. They have introduced their Global Hypersonic and Orbital Spaceport Technology, or GHOST. The idea here is pretty simple. Rocket Lab wants to make its Electron and HASTE missions launchable from almost anywhere in the world without needing to build a permanent launch site at every location. How do you do this though? Well, you've got to make the launch complex itself portable and deployable. Although such a thing would be impossible with something like SpaceX's Starship, with a much smaller rocket like Electron, this actually makes a lot of sense. Rocket Lab plans to pack everything required to launch into standard shipping containers. Think of all the ground hardware, launch infrastructure, range control systems, and obviously the rockets themselves. This all opens the door to a whole range of applications, including hypersonic flight testing, responsive launches, missile defense testing, and potentially even orbital launches from countries that don't have their own dedicated orbital spaceport. I'm looking at you, Australia. Now, you may think this is a long-term plan, right? Well, not so fast, because they are starting with 2 new Ghost pads at Rocket Lab's Launch Complex 4 at Kodiak in Alaska. They even recently announced a $266 million Space Force contract for 12 suborbital launches. This even has options for 6 additional missions primarily supporting missile defense. Based on all this, you would think that we are looking at years away, right? Wrong! Rocket Lab is targeting 2027 for the new Ghost pads at Alaska. In the meantime, the first launch under this Space Force contract is expected no earlier than the end of this year. Now, Blue Origin has been doing some interesting testing. They were out here with a New Glenn second stage simulator to test out their new vertical operations that will become the norm for launches at Launch Complex 36A. This was just a forward dome and the full-sized payload fairing, but the team did vertical stacking lifts and mating exercises to gather all the data they could from these new mechanisms. It is pretty cool to see them working on what they call the concept of operations while the pad is still being repaired and redesigned. They had also shared this too. It's a render of what they believe Launch Complex 36B will look like with 36A in the background there. This one in front though will instead support New Glenn's 9x4 engine vehicle. As far as we know, they want to keep the 7x2 configuration well into the future and just launch that from 36A. Take a look at that 9x4 rocket here though. That second stage is so long it almost looks bizarre. For this, they are going to need a new vertical integration facility along with a new payload processing facility, so the infrastructure for both New Glenn vehicles is really going to be quite different. Now, how could I not mention the breathtaking solar eclipse this week? For those of you in the path here across parts of Spain, Portugal, Iceland, Greenland and northern Russia, the total eclipse was something really quite special. Much of Europe at least experienced a partial eclipse, but yeah, this was all happening on Wednesday this week, and the images flooding into social media were breathtaking. NASA was live streaming the views from Spain, and as it approached totality, you could really see the solar activity around that disk was absolutely spectacular. Were you there in person watching this magic? I'd love to know what you thought of this one, and I hope you had a nice clear view of the sky wherever you may have been watching from. Now, ever since NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman's ignition event, we have been seeing steady progress towards the ultimate goal of having a permanent moon base and eventually expanding outward into the rest of the solar system. There has been something to talk about almost every week, and early this week, NASA announced that they have successfully tested a lithium-powered electric thruster. This is called a magnetoplasmadynamic or MPD thruster, and unlike conventional chemical rockets, it doesn't just burn fuel to produce thrust. Instead, it sends huge amounts of electrical current through vaporized lithium, it ionizes it into plasma, and then uses magnetic fields to accelerate that plasma out of the engine. This first test impressed a lot of people, with the prototype reaching 120 kilowatts. That's more than 25 times the power of the electric thrusters currently flying on NASA's Psyche spacecraft. During this test, the central tungsten electrode reached temperatures higher than 2800 degrees Celsius, and if that doesn't feel crazy enough, the team eventually wants to scale this thing up to 1 megawatt. As impressive as that sounds, that still wouldn't be enough to power a human trip to Mars. Such a mission, NASA believes, would require 2 to 4 megawatts of power and multiple MPD thrusters. With that, the system needs to survive for more than 23,000 hours of operational time. That's because these technologies are all about slow, gradual, efficient thrust over long periods of time, instead of the much less efficient brute force approach from chemical engines. So there is another week wrapped up for you, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, don't forget to hit subscribe so we get to keep making them. If you missed this video here and have a little more time to help us out, check out this one next. Thanks for watching all this way through as always. I'll catch you next weekend.